like a train early Wednesday morning. A line of potent thunderstorms progressed through the New England states, providing for significant wind damage. Many residents feared a tornado, but after the National Weather Service surveyed damage, they determined a microburst. This microburst was responsible for uprooting dozens of trees and knocking down utility poles. The straight-line winds associated with the microburst Wednesday in East Hampton reached 100 miles per hour. No injuries or fatalities were reported. A microburst is a strong, small-scale downburst that produces strong straight-line winds associated with a thunderstorm. These storms and showers were associated with a strong cold front that raced across the Northeast and New England states. Although dry weather is expected for the end of the work week in New England, cloudy skies and some passing showers will work their way back in by Saturday.
U.S. health officials saying the death of a toddler in New Jersey has been directly tied to this mysterious virus that's sickening children across the country. 4-year-old Eli Waller's only symptom was pink eye when he went to bed one night. That was 2 weeks ago, but he never woke up. The entire community now in New Jersey now mourning for the family's loss.
Eli Waller's death is the first confirmed fatality of Enterovirus D68 in the U.S. The preschooler's death has understandably caused a great deal of fear for many in his community and for parents of young children who went to school or came in contact with him in his preschool program at Yardville Elementary School in Hamilton, New Jersey. Now, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the virus has sickened a total of 538 people in 43 states and Washington, D.C., almost all of them children. Eli Waller died in his sleep, as you mentioned, after going to bed with pink eye September 25th. It's important to note he showed no signs of Enterovirus D68, which usually includes fever, runny nose, sneezing, cough, or wheezing. A second child who reportedly is showing symptoms of the virus and was a classmate of Waller's is being tested for the virus, according to local reports.
United Airlines flight that's being held in Newark at Terminal B. The New Jersey and New York Port Authority has confirmed this to Fox News. Being held due to a sick passenger on board, and passengers are not able to leave because of this.
Right.
Should we suspect that this might be another proactive step to make sure it isn't Ebola?
Well, listen, anything is possible, and right now every precaution has to be taken. In Newark, the CDC has an isolation center where they can take this passenger and sort of evaluate everything that has been going on, whether they came from that part of West Africa, whether they have any real bad symptoms that are flu-like, and checks his temperature, and that from that point on, at least in that CDC office in the airport, they can then transport him to another medical center, and again, minimize the contamination of patients, especially if he's sick.
A nurse in Spain is now becoming the first known person to contract Ebola outside of West Africa. Some now calling for flights to be halted from Ebola-plagued countries, but the Obama administration says it's considering screening of passengers who come into the United States from West Africa.
We have learned some lessons, though, in terms of what happened in Dallas. We don't have a lot of margin for error. The procedures and protocols that are put in place must be followed.
Jonathan Seri live in Atlanta. So, Jonathan, what do we know about this nurse so far?
Martha, Spanish authorities have yet to release her name, but we know that she had treated two Spanish priests who became infected with Ebola while ministering to patients in West Africa. Those two priests eventually died while hospitalized in Spain. One of the priests had received the experimental drug ZMapp. The other did not, because supplies had run out worldwide and are expected to take another 2 months to be replenished. Hospital officials say the nurse is in stable condition and has no symptoms besides fever, but as a precaution, Spanish authorities are placing her husband and a second nurse under quarantine and are also working to identify others who had contact with this nurse in question, Martha.
All right, so in terms of international flights that are coming in, is there a protocol in place today, or is it still being worked out?
Well, Martha, as you heard from the president, there are no immediate plans to ban any international flights, and that's based on the advice of federal health officials and international health officials who say doing so would not solve the crisis, that there's always going to be an Ebola risk to the U.S. as long as there's an outbreak going on in West Africa, and that banning international flights would further isolate these countries, make it harder to attack the outbreak at its source, and also destabilize their already fragile economies.
The heads of both the Dallas and Denton County Health Departments classify the deputy as low risk. Let's get you to Fox 4's Brandon Todd with that.
Spike, I just want to start with Denton County's Director of Public Health. They issued a statement saying at this time we don't classify this Frisco patient as a contact. They don't believe he fits the definition of an Ebola contact, and because he hasn't had any contact with an Ebola patient or anyone symptomatic, they don't see him as a threat to the public health. Now, Zach Thompson with Dallas's Public Health said that he was one of the few people inside that apartment when Eric Duncan was in the hospital, and he remembers Sergeant Michael Monig there as well. Now, Thompson told me today that he understands why Sergeant Monig went to get checked out Monday, but the director of Dallas Health and Human Services said it is very unlikely that the sergeant has Ebola.
We've seen a lot of understandable concern because of the deadly nature of Ebola, and we're really hoping for the recovery of the patient in Dallas. We understand that his situation has taken a turn for the worse. We know that Ebola is a very serious disease, and we're hoping for his recovery. But because it's such a deadly disease, people are scared, and it's normal to be scared. In fact, for the healthcare workers who are caring for people with Ebola, we want them to be scared. We want them to have a healthy respect of the risk of any lapse in infection control procedure. We want them to channel that fear into being incredibly meticulous about infection control. Are things we're doing and can do to reduce that risk, like checking temperatures? This individual wasn't infectious while they were traveling, but we know that as long as the outbreak smolders in Africa, as long as it's in Africa, we're potentially at risk, because even if we tried to close the border, it wouldn't work. People have a right to return. People transiting through could come in, and it would backfire, because by isolating these countries, it'll make it harder to help them, it'll spread more there, and we'd be more likely to be exposed here.
No one, and I mean no one, should be allowed to enter the United States from any West African nation ravaged by Ebola. And any American citizen who goes there and wants to come home needs to be quarantined for 21 days until we figure out what we're doing. Look, we have a real problem. I don't want to hurt anybody, and I'm good with sending humanitarian aid to those in need, fill up those C-130s with supplies and doctors, and do those military transports. But guess what? At a certain point, you take priority over everyone else in the world. And when it comes to the health and security of your family and my family, everyone else takes a back seat. The fact that we're even having this discussion is insane. Now, we're told that it would be counterproductive to the economy of Liberia to stop flights from coming here. Really? Another country's economy is not the criteria to determine whether we put our families at risk. And trying not to offend the rest of the world, making nice so people won't be angry, or making other countries economically successful, and any other politically correct hogwash coming out of Washington be damned. Your job is to protect us.
anyone in any doubt about this organisation can now see how truly repulsive it is and barbaric it is.
That from British Prime Minister David Cameron reacting to yesterday's horrific beheading of British aid worker Alan Henning, and is vowing to, quote, use all assets we have to help other hostages and their families. ISIS not backing down and now threatening to kill another American who's also an aid worker and a former Army Ranger, Peter Kasich, abducted last December, and his family is now speaking out. Leland Bittert is joining us with more on this story. Leland?
Well, and just a couple of hours ago, Uma, we didn't even know that Peter Kasich was being held inside Syria. Late last night, the National Security Council confirmed Peter Kasich, the man from Indiana, is now in the hands of ISIS. And the terrorist group released their latest beheading video, true to form, by displaying another hostage and saying essentially he is next. Alan Henning was a British aid worker kidnapped in Syria and held by ISIS. In this video, we're showing you a still picture right now. Henning makes a statement clearly under duress in the minutes before his execution. On the tape, what appears to be the same masked executioner as in previous ISIS tapes speaks with a strong British accent and says that because of American airstrikes in Syria, Kasich would be next. Kasich once served as an Army Ranger, even did time in Iraq before being medically discharged back in 2007. He is from Indiana and went to the Middle East as an aid worker, was abducted in Lebanon while helping Syrian refugees. His abduction and detention by ISIS was not publicly reported until now, and his parents have taken to YouTube to issue a desperate plea.
At an early age, our son was inspired by his grandfather to do humanitarian work. When he saw the suffering of the Syrian people, he went to Turkey and founded an organization to provide aid and assistance.
Dear son, we hope that you will see this message from me and your father. We are so very proud of you and the work you have done to bring humanitarian aid to the Syrian people. We implore those who are holding you to show mercy and use their power to let you go.
In recent weeks, ISIS has executed 4 Western hostages and posted all of the videos on YouTube. It was 2 Americans and 2 Brits. It's unclear how many additional Western hostages ISIS now holds. The National Security Council issued a statement saying they would continue to use every tool at their disposal to try and bring Peter home.
Now to the fight against Islamic extremists in Iraq and Syria. Despite recent airstrikes on the strategic Syrian city of Kobani near the border with Turkey, ISIS fighters are still on the advance. The terrorists are targeting Kobani because of its key location between 2 other areas already in their control. Greg Palcott joins us live from the Turkey-Syria border with the latest. Greg?
Shannon, one official in the besieged Syrian town of Kobani is warning of a, quote, large-scale massacre if ISIS terrorists make it into that town. It is looking more and more likely that that will happen. Take a look at what we saw close to the front line.
This is the closest that we have seen and heard to a sustained battle here in the town of Kobani, just across the border from where we are in Syria. You can see smoke coming up from impacts on the Tower Hill there, and over to the left, this is the eastern side of the city, and we've seen a lot of firing there. ISIS tanks, ISIS mortars shooting in, and we're hearing small arms fire coming from the Kurdish defenders of the city. Again, all across the city, we are seeing impacts. There's a lot more tension in the air.
The shells were landing fast and furious. A few landed not far from us inside Turkey. One struck a house, injuring a family of 5. Following that, Turkish authorities evacuated 3 villages near the border. Now, we spotted very clearly ISIS weapons fired repeatedly from one location just a few miles east of Kobani. Defending the town may be a few thousand ill-equipped Kurdish fighters and their supporters. CENTCOM confirms to us they did not launch any airstrikes overnight. There were some the day before. The lack of more airstrikes from the United States has people upset here, as does the fact that Turkey, despite a big presence of military on their side of the border, is not going in yet either. There have been differences in the past between Turkey and the ethnic Kurds in this area. Again, the fall of Kobani could have huge strategic and symbolic importance for the ISIS terrorists. Our military expert on the ground here says that that could happen the way things are going today in the next 48 hours. And to quote once again, that official inside Kobani, where is the world?
And so we have to act as if it's coming tomorrow.
FBI Director James Comey trying to calm fears that terrorists could launch terror attacks right here on U.S. soil, saying his agency is acting with vigilance and keeping an eye on a dozen Americans fighting alongside extremist groups in Syria. Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge is in Washington with the latest. Hello, Catherine.
Well, thank you, Shannon. FBI Director James Comey says he's aware of a dozen Americans fighting with extremist groups in Syria, but acknowledged there could be more. Comey first made the assessment during an on-the-record session with reporters in late September, reported by Fox News, and now for a second time in this interview with CBS's 60 Minutes.
How many Americans are fighting in Syria on the side of the terrorists?
In the area of a dozen or so.
Do you know who they are?
Yes.
Each and every one of them?
I think of that dozen or so I do. I hesitate only because I don't know what I don't know.
Comey also said he would do everything in his power to monitor the militant fighters if they return to the United States, adding there are a few blocks. And in most cases, American citizens have the right to enter and exit freely from the U.S.
Ultimately, an American citizen, unless their passport's revoked, is entitled to come back. So someone who's fought with ISIL with an American passport wants to come back, we will track them very carefully.
A 19-year-old man in Illinois is now facing terror-related charges after the feds say he tried to join the Islamic State. This is the suspect. His name, Mohammed Khan. FBI agents arrested him Saturday, we're told, at the O'Hare International Airport in Chicago. He was in court today. According to prosecutors, he bought airline tickets to and from Turkey. The return date was supposed to be this Wednesday, but they say he told agents he had never intended to come back to the United States at any point. Prosecutors say at his parents' home, investigators found handwritten documents supporting ISIS, a list of contacts inside Syria, and a 3-page letter in which he tells his parents about his decision to go. And in that letter, he apparently asks them not to say anything to the authorities. They're not talking to reporters today. Prosecutors say the suspect was angry with what he called the decline of Western societies, that they were getting more immoral every day. They say he was also mad about paying taxes, which he claimed the government was using to kill Muslims. Garrett Tenney is live for us in Chicago now. And Garrett, do we know if this guy was acting alone?
Well, Harris, the U.S. Attorney's Office tells us this 19-year-old Mohammed Hamza Khan is the only person that's been charged in this case, but they add that this is an ongoing investigation. We do know the FBI found that list of contacts in one of Khan's notebooks during their search, and the team later told investigators he planned to join the terrorist group by navigating his way through Turkey to the Syrian border with the help of a Turkish contact he was introduced to by another individual he'd met online.
Another Fox News alert to tell you about now, because there is growing concern over ISIS and terror as police in London announced that they've just arrested 4 more suspected terrorists in raids across that city today. Scotland Yard saying the suspects, all men, all in their early 20s. Right now they're in custody. They are being questioned, and police are searching their homes and their cars in what they're calling an ongoing investigation into Islamic-related terrorism. Con Coughlin is the defense editor for The Telegraph, and he is my guest. Great to see you, Con. I know that you have just received new details from Scotland Yard about what these 4 people may have been up to. What have you learned?
Hi, Gretchen. Good to be with you. Well, this is a breaking story here in London, but the material that we have from Scotland Yard and the intelligence services is that they have uncovered the first ISIS plot here in the UK, basically British jihadists coming back to London and wanting to carry out a plot, and I'm told that the plot was to behead people on the streets of London. You may remember just over a year ago a British soldier was beheaded in daylight by an Islamic fanatic.
Yes.
What I'm told about this plot is this group that had recently come back from Syria was planning to carry out beheadings, I say plural, on the streets of London in the next few days or so, and this plot has been disrupted. As I said, Gretchen, it's early days. We don't have all the details yet, but that's how it's shaping up at this very moment.
Well, that's startling, because of course that would set a whole new tone in ISIS coming to Western nations.
groups of refugees are crossing into Turkey from Syria as they flee the Islamic State onslaught. But it's possible, though, that some of these civilians, for example, could be terrorists. That's according to Washington. Jihadist masterminds are reportedly trying to send undercover agents to Western Europe through Turkey, all in the guise of refugees. Polly Boyker investigates.
But this has all come from US intelligence, who have reportedly decoded some of the conversations taking place between Islamic State leaders, and they're said to be discussing plans to send Islamic State militants disguised as Syrian refugees into Western Europe to commit acts of terror. They're said to be planning on traveling in groups of up to 4 people, and they would be part of that wave of Syrian refugees that are fleeing across the border into Turkey as a result of the conflict in Syria. Now, from Turkey, they are planning on using fake passports in order to continue their journey into Western Europe. The leaked conversations also reveal that they're not planning on traveling through airports or using air travel because they consider the security there to be too tight. But I think this is going to be very concerning for the anti-terror police across the European continent, especially considering that Britain, France and other European countries have already signed up to that anti-IS coalition. They're already taking part in those airstrikes over Iraq against the Islamic State. So there were already fears of retaliatory strikes. And of course, considering the UN Security Council's unanimous resolution against violent extremism that condemned anybody traveling out to join the jihad, well, now they have the opposite problem, and they have to deal with these very detailed plans from the Islamic State leaders about getting violent extremists to travel back to Western Europe to commit acts of terror.
Exactly how they end up in the very heart of Europe. The main points of entry are Italy and Greece. From there, refugees have gone on to seek asylum in at least 5 European countries. Germany, for example, Sweden are taking the most of them, though the Netherlands and Switzerland, even Bulgaria, those are among the top destinations.
A Nebraska school district is getting national attention tonight for its effort to make classrooms more inclusive. Trace Gallagher has more. Trace?
Megan, the controversy caught fire. Now the Lincoln, Nebraska school district is trying to tamp it down, holding a news conference a short time ago saying this gender lesson was only for teachers, not students and parents, and these aren't new rules, but rather suggestions so that teachers can avoid terms that might offend kids, like being called boys and girls. A group called Gender Spectrum came up with a 12-step program to help teachers navigate gender confusion. For example, quote, avoid asking kids to line up as boys or girls or separating them by gender. Instead, use things like odd and even birthdays, or ask, which would you choose, skateboards or bikes? Or this one, quote, don't use phrases such as boys and girls, you guys, ladies and gentlemen. Instead, say, calling all readers, hey campers, and the now famous purple penguins. And when you hear others referencing gender in a binary manner, you know, using boy and girl, you should, quote, ask things like, that's interesting. Can you say more about that? Or what makes you say that? I think of it a little differently. Many parents were unhappy with these so-called helpful hints, so the school district came out to clarify. Listen.
This was about adults, professional educators who care deeply about trying to reach and establish relationships with children, looking for strategies on how they can be more effective in their classroom.
So calling kids purple penguins is not a new policy, Megan. It's just a thought.
Tell me more about that. Thank you, Trace.
Some backlash now from Utah's governor over the Supreme Court decision that rejected 5 state appeals that were seeking to ban same-sex marriage. William Lungeness live with more on this. So, William, what are the governor and conservative groups in Utah saying about all this today?
Well, Martha, you know, these 5 states had banned same-sex marriage. Several lower courts said they couldn't do that, and yesterday the Supreme Court decided not to hear the case, letting those lower court rulings stand, effectively expanding gay marriage to half the country and now making it legal in Indiana, Oklahoma, Utah, Virginia, and Wisconsin, where gays and lesbians immediately began getting married. Still, opponents did not go quietly. Oklahoma's Governor Mary Fallin said the will of the people of Oklahoma had been hijacked by unelected federal justices. Utah's Gary Herbert said states should have the right to determine their own law on the issue, but would uphold the court's decision.
I am surprised about this and disappointed. I believe that the people deserve to have this hearing taking place at the Supreme Court level to determine, you know, what is a significant issue of our time.
It's a surprise that the Supreme Court didn't do their job. You know, marriage is a states' rights issue, and it has nothing to do with the federal government.
very first numbers that we saw was on, and as this, we've seen some changes in how the cases of these immigrants are being handled. There can be growing concern about the way this is being handled by the government.
And how are they being handled?
Well, very early on, during the first 2 weeks of the operation, we saw numbers, the very first numbers that we saw were 138 immigrants deported and 12 immigrants released into the United States that were given asylum. This past week, and that was a rate of 10 to 1 were being deported. This past week, there were 68 releases versus 13 deportations. So all of a sudden, it's a 4 to 1 ratio of people being released out into the United States with a very small bond, which a bond of $2,000 or $3,000 is probably not going to get somebody to return for their court date at all.
I want to make sure I understand this, Mr. Mayor, because I was under the impression that in a lockdown, no one was allowed to come in or leave. But you're telling us now that by a rate of 4 to 1, the tide has turned. People are being released out into the United States. We've got less than a minute. I just want to make sure I understand that correctly.
That's correct, and that was for a period that included between the lockdowns. You're correct. Currently, this current week, nobody is leaving or coming.
Fair enough. Mayor Philip Birch, we hope you will rejoin us as the action continues there at that new facility in your town, Artesia, New Mexico. We thank you for your time this morning, sir, and we look forward to speaking to you again in the not-too-distant future.
Congressman, please call anytime, and thank you.